and systems in a way designed to maintain current conditions or restoring to some previous desired state. So the conservation challenge in the future is how to plan and act with climate conditions shifting in ways that have no past analog. And the big question then is about what constitutes good adaptation. That's really the focus of this talk, that is different from how we already do conservation. So to help answer this question and to help convert the theory of adaptation into practice, the National Wildlife Federation convened an experts work group to develop guidance on climate-smart conservation. And this group consists of a broad set of experts from NGO communities, from state agencies, and a variety of U.S. federal entities. And it's actually a follow-on to this guide that you see up in the right-hand corner called Scanning the Conservation Horizon. This is a previous guide that was put together with this broad stakeholder group to talk about how to do vulnerability assessments and what vulnerability assessments are. And the reason that there's Julia Child's The Way to Cook there at the bottom is to focus on the intent that it's not a one-size-fits-all type cookbook, but really you need to approach this as a how-to do this, and really guidance that help people understand the underlying principles as opposed to looking at it as a step-by-step process. So the most important attribute of climate-smart conservation can be thought of as intentionality. And that is that being intentional and deliberative and considering how climate change is going to affect resources in the places that you're working, and rather than just assuming that good conservation, as we've always done it, is going to be enough. So this work group has concluded that in the face of climate change, good conservation isn't good enough. Okay. Is that better? Thank you. The work group has developed a generalized adaptation planning and implementation framework to help structure its guidance development work. And the guidance is being structured around the various steps in this cycle. And the cycle that you see is quite similar to many existing conservation planning processes by design. Basically understanding vulnerabilities and reviewing and revising goals are the first two steps, and those are really important steps to sort of the premise here that we really need to understand what the impacts are, and we need to know what our targets are, and then to take steps toward identifying options, evaluating and prioritizing the actions, and that this is an iterative and ongoing exercise. That you're not going to do an assessment and decide what your adaptation plan is and then just be done with it. This is something that's going to continue to be iterative. So one way to think about this is to consider it in 3 stages of evolution. So you start with the business as usual, in which traditional goals are met through traditional strategies. The degree to which adaptation is being added in then to those kinds of conservation strategies can be considered a retrofit, that you basically then start to use climate change as a new filter to existing approaches and to decide whether your strategies are still going to be effective under climate change. But ultimately it's going to be important to move toward a new modification of our goals and to think about climate change explicitly from the start, and they talk about this as being climate smart from the start. So some of the key characteristics of the climate smart conservation actions, they have developed a set of conditions to think about. And first and foremost of these is to link your actions to climate change explicitly, and that's this idea of showing your work. So that this harkens back to the idea of being intentional, to explicitly address climate change from the beginning and to use best available science knowledge as a foundation for that work. Make sure that you're forward-looking in your goals. Conservation goals need to focus on the future and not the past. climate and ecological conditions of the past may not be that helpful for where we're headed in the future. So strategies need to take a long view, looking decades to centuries, but need to account for near-term conservation challenges and needed transition strategies. And also this idea of thinking in terms of the broader landscape context. On-the-ground actions are designed in the context of broader geographic scales, and any individual management unit has to consider the context that they're in, especially for things like species shifts, changes in ecological processes, and also just more broadly to remote collaboration. So strategies and actions also need to provide benefit across a range of possible future conditions. This is the idea of looking at doing climate forecasting, but also more broadly scenario planning, walking out how management decisions may change under different conditions. And then also embedded in this is the need to have an agile and informed management. Conservation planning and resource management is capable of continuous learning and dynamic adjustment to accommodate uncertainty, and we need to design our planning frameworks around that. Take advantage of new knowledge as it comes along. We know that climate change is an ever-changing field, and we have to be able to build that kind of iterative process within our planning schemes and be able to cope with some of the shifts in climate, ecological, and social conditions. And so what you see up here is just an example of the National Park Service adaptation planning framework. This, again, is aligned with a lot of other types of adaptation frameworks, but it really just outlines the need to frame the issues so you know what your questions are, and then to go in and synthesize, evaluate the science, make sure that you explore plausible futures, and then the planning and implementation action, but always having the sort of monitoring your actions and being able to come back and revise as necessary. The other characteristic that's important to keep in mind is to minimize the carbon footprint. Strategies and projects need to minimize energy use, greenhouse gas emissions, and sustain the natural ability of ecosystems to cycle and sequester carbon and other greenhouse gases. And then another characteristic is to look at the influence of climate on your project success. Basically, projects that are either designed to specifically address climate change, as we talked about, or this idea of making sure that you look at existing approaches and do this retrofit. That you use a climate filter, you ask yourself the question of whether your approach is still valid in the face of climate change, and not just assuming that it is. And then finally, it's important to have strategies and actions that enhance the capacity of ecosystems to protect human communities from climate change and also sustain ways of life. And then the final one, avoiding maladaptation. This is, in the Park Service, we talk about this as no-gainers. Sometimes we talk about strategies that are no-brainers, things that you would take under any condition, but you also need to be aware of things that are maladaptive. Are there actions that we're doing right now that we shouldn't be doing under any future condition with climate change, and finding ways to identify those? So I wanted to just pose an answer to a couple of your questions about what are the gaps that we have for adaptation, and I don't have a slide for this, but this idea that Climate Smart Group is really focusing on the need for new goals, making sure that you have your goals and targets in place. And I would say that that's one of the biggest challenges for land management agencies. Oftentimes our goals are set in our enabling legislation. They're specific to mission, and these are really difficult things to change quickly. So this idea of having to know what your targets are, I'm going to agree in theory that this is really important. But we aren't going to be able to just stop and reevaluate the targets and wait for action. So we're in this process of sort of building the bicycle while riding it. We have to be moving forward at the same time. So I would pose that as a challenge that maybe this group can think about how to help meet that need. Thanks.